And how wonderful. So please give a warm welcome to Sam Van Aken.
I don't know what happened. Oh, there's the computer. There we go. Ooh, that's good. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I'm from Syracuse, so I can definitely sympathize with the weather. Typically, we get what you get 6 hours later, so I'm always looking to Buffalo, oddly. So it's, as John was mentioning, it's amazing to be here tonight because in many ways the Tree of 40 Fruit Project actually began and evolved out of the show here at Hallwalls. Leading up to that exhibition, I had been doing a lot of work which at the time was called new media and has since become just regular media. But I was doing a lot of sound-based and video-based work like this piece entitled Oh My God. So this is an 8-foot tall by 50-foot long wall made of home stereo speakers that I sort of stacked in and amongst each other. At the same time I was collecting the speakers, I also started to collect clips of people saying, "Oh my God." And the first utterance of it that I really noticed was in the video that was played of the second plane crashing into the World Trade Center. And as that video became more and more numbing, like the video somehow lost impact, but that woman's voice in the background still sent like a shudder down my spine. And I thought about that phrase and how it has multiple realities to it. It has multiple ways in which we use it. It becomes ecstasy, it becomes terror, it becomes joy. And so I took these 600 clips of people saying, "Oh my God," and I used this computer and created an algorithm that randomly selected from the database of clips and then randomly sent it out to the speakers. So I think in the end I collected 750 home stereo speakers, which makes you start to question your sanity, or like, you start to become like, am I the cliche of the artist? Like, I forget who played that Van Gogh character, but so the clips, the piece, the duration of it is 6 minutes. And what happens is, as you experience the piece, you walk into the room and you'll hear "Oh my God" from one speaker, "Oh my God" from another, and it gradually builds up to a crescendo until at the end all of the speakers are shouting "Oh my God," and then it just cuts out with a reverberation that fills the room afterwards. In addition to doing sort of this media-based work, the other thing that the other sort of concurrent idea that I'd always been working with was grafting. This is where I grew up. It's a dairy farm in Pennsylvania. We farmed, it was a 200-acre farm, but we farmed about 400 acres and milked 200 cows every morning and afternoon. And for any of you that have worked on a farm, you could understand my wanting to escape it and wanting to get into art. But the idea of grafting stuck with me throughout that time, and I played with it as a concept. So I remember the first project I did with grafting was I took 2 pieces of plastic fruit and stuck them together, and I was like, oh, that's like grafting. Eventually, in an attempt to sort of make it real, I started doing these gardens that were all grafted together. So having sort of all nightshade family, so like tomatoes, peppers, there are even nightshade flowers, petunias, all grafted together, and having a garden on one stalk. And that was all sort of within the same family that I was doing those pieces. And then this was the eventual sort of installation. So leading up to the Hallwalls exhibition, I become fascinated, well, actually I've always been fascinated by the War of the Worlds broadcast. And during the broadcast, for those of you that don't know, aliens were purported to land in Grover's Mills, New Jersey, and essentially start a war. It was a radio broadcast. Orson Welles had done it like a couple of nights before Halloween. It was the first example of a radio hoax, and one of the things that I didn't know is that Grover's Mills was an actual town. So I was driving through New Jersey, and I saw the sign for Grover's Mills, and I was like, this is crazy. So I got to the center of the town of Grover's Mills and found this house, which was the original home of the Mr. Grover, who the town was named after, and it was right next to the mill. And but it was really interesting. So they have a big sort of commemorative bronze sculpture, so like I guess that's how you commemorate things. But the really interesting thing that I found in the backyard of Mr. Grover's house was this tower. So, and this tower kind of had this local folklore. So I spent a couple of days in Grover's Mills. It became like a little bit more than a stop off. I started talking to everyone. And this tower, what made it important is that on the night of the radio hoax, the citizens of Grover's Mills were so convinced that there were aliens that had landed in their city that they actually went out with guns in hand, mistook the water tower. It was a water tower, it was a windmill, but on that night it became the alien ship, and they started shooting at it. And they fired all of these holes through it. And I asked the homeowner to if I could take some photographs of it, and she said she was like, "Thank you so much. There's somebody that was snuck onto my property, slipped on my pool cover, and is now suing me." She's like, "I wish I could just get rid of the thing," and I'm like, "I'll take it." So I turned it into a broadcast antenna, and this is the upstairs, and then started to do a hoax. Now, the reason for Hallwalls is that in 1968, there was a local radio station in Buffalo that aired a War of the Worlds broadcast. And it was a slight variation. I think it had something to do with, it was sort of like some other country was invading rather than aliens, which is a little more believable, sadly. So they had restaged a successful hoax. So I sort of set up this studio, and these are all sort of the sound making props for staging the hoax, and recorded it and played it through the gallery. I still use that, which is this radio broadcast antenna that has like a 20-mile radius to it, which it's great. You can do your own programming. The thing that my ultimate problem with it was the fact that I was duping people, right? And that part of it, I don't know, it made me feel uneasy with the project. And the other thing is that, so I did that show, and I don't know, that the duping became a problem. And then the thing that I was really fascinated with out of the work, though, is actually the tower, right? So it started off as a windmill, and it's when it was originally built, and then it became a standpipe, so it provided indoor plumbing to the house. It became an alien ship, and then I was turning it into a radio broadcast antenna. So I went back to the idea of the hoax, and I thought, okay, I got to rethink this. And in looking at the etymology of the term hoax comes from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist where the priest says, "Hoc est enim corpus meum." And so it's the point in the Eucharist where the priest says, "This is my body," and transforms the bread into the body of Christ. And it's sort of like a central tenet to Catholicism that that's not bread anymore. That is the body of Christ. And that whole process is known as transubstantiation. And so I was wondering, okay, how could I take something and change its reality without changing its appearance? And taking that previous work, where I was working with media and then also working with grafting, that eventually led to the concept of the tree of 40 fruit. So the idea behind the tree of 40 fruit, that it's a single tree that grows 40 different types of stone fruit, peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, and almonds all on one tree. Throughout the majority of the year, it's a normal looking tree until spring when it blossoms in all of these different colors. And so to get into the sort of technical part of it, the trees are developed through grafting. And this is primarily the method that I'll use. It's called whip grafting. I'll go out and I'll collect branches in February, store them in a refrigerator, hold them until April, until the trees start to break bud or bud swell, and then I'll start working on the trees, building them up. And for those of you that don't know, like almost all fruit trees are grafted, right? Because the seed of a fruit tree is a genetic variant of the parent. It's an adaptability trait. And so if you were to take any type of seed planted in the ground, it's going to be slightly different from its parent. So anytime that we have a fruit tree that we like the fruit from, you do clonal propagation, which is taking a branch from it and sticking it onto a root structure. This is how, and it's pretty shocking to think that every single Macintosh apple in the world came from one tree that's been grafted thousands and thousands of times. And so this is the way that trees are actually started. So these are, I don't know, 20 to 30 trees that I've grafted, and I'll grow them for 2 or 3 years to create the tree of 40 fruit. And what I'll do is I'll head them off. So I'll take out the central leader to the tree so that they form 3 or 4 branches. And then what I'll do is I'll go in and start to use another grafting technique known as bud grafting. And with bud grafting, you do that typically from mid-July to, well, with global warming now, you can stretch it to mid-September. And you'll take the branch right off the tree and graft it to the host tree. And in that way, I can put 4 or 5 grafts onto one single branch, and I can start to exponentially grow the tree out from there. So the trees are very much constructed. So these, I have diagrams for all the trees that I'm working on. The colors here denote the year when the grafting was done. Typically, it takes about 6 years to grow a tree of 40 fruit from start to finish. And so here's what this projector's really blown out. There's a lot more pink than you're seeing there. So this is a 6-year-old tree that has 40 varieties grafted to it. And this is what it'll start to look like in spring. And then here's how the branches look from the trees with the combination of all the different fruit. Just go through these. So one of the problems I had when I initially began the project was that I went out looking for 40 different types of stone fruit, and I couldn't find any. And New York State, 100 years ago, was a second leading producer of stone fruits in the country, next to only California. And that industry has largely disappeared. There's no one growing them. So I got lucky, and I found the last university research orchard in the eastern United States. And I found it at about the time they were going to cut it down. And so I used some grants from art institutions, actually, and kept this orchard alive until I could collect all the varieties and then graft them onto my trees. And so what I started to do is I didn't have a lot of space. That's about 2,000 square feet. And so I had to start grafting all of these different trees together, right? And in that process, what I realized is I could actually take entire orchards and use the tree of 40 fruit to collapse the space, to bring it all onto one tree. So as the project evolved, what I started to do is I would go to different locations throughout the country, and I would research the varieties that were grown there historically, and I would go out, source them, and graft them onto the tree of 40 fruit that was there, so that it becomes a sort of agricultural history of that area and preserves all of those fruit. And so here's a couple of the different locations. And eventually that extended into doing sort of multiples of these tree of 40 fruit. Because generally what you would find is like 100 years ago, you would find that there were hundreds and hundreds of different varieties grown in one particular area. Now it's just we've constructed such large monocultures that we only grow maybe 2 or 3 different varieties of each type of food. And so, you know, the more trees, the more we're able to preserve the varieties. And so these are the different locations for the tree of 40 fruit so far. So at that point, I had thought I was done with the Tree of 40 Fruit project. I was like, okay, I'm going around. It sort of became this model where, well, the one thing I started to do was, at first it was art collectors that really supported the project. But I started to realize that I was making these projects and they were for like 1 or 2 people. And it's a lot of work, 6 years worth of work. And so what I would start to do is, like I wasn't selling to private collectors anymore. I would have them pay for a tree that would go into a public setting. And that idea of sort of going to different locations and grafting the different varieties. And I thought, okay, I've done my part for it. And I had actually moved on to start working with the weather. So one of the things that, that came up through the Tree of 40 Fruit is the idea of climate change. So what happens, what's pretty much become custom now is that in January and February, we get that 1 week of 70 to 80 degree weather. And what happens to the fruit trees is that the fruit trees will start to blossom. And since we're in Buffalo and Syracuse, you know, it'll freeze, you know, dozens more times after that, and it kills off all of the blossoms onto the trees. And when I first started the project, I thought the interesting thing was I would go to orchards, I would talk to growers, and growers would be questioning climate change. And within a 4-year period, I saw attitudes change to the point where people are trying to adapt to it. And so one of the ways that they're adapting to this now is you actually have to grow cold, hardier varieties in a warmer climate, ones that won't be forced to blossom early and can sustain those 70 to 80 degree weeks. And so with the, you know, with just sort of this engagement, like every morning I'm listening to the weather to see what I'm gonna have to work on with the trees. And my mother told me this story of my grandfather, who was the one who built that farm I showed an image of. And so, I don't know, she was trying to get me to come to her house. I'm like, Mom, I'm busy with trees. And she's like, you're just like your grandfather. And so apparently when she was a child, there was a drought. And it was so bad that one night she was walking past my grandparents' bedroom and she saw my grandfather like kneeling by the side of the bed, like crying and praying that it would actually rain. Just because of, that all of our money was in those seeds and in the ground. And I started to think about, well, what happens when we get to the end of technology? Like so much of my earlier work was based on employing technology. And what happens when you reach the end of it and you have to start essentially like the metaphysical? Like at what point does technology end and the metaphysical begin? And so that led to working with attempting to change the weather. So this was an exhibition at Munson Williams Proctor a few years ago, and what I did is I went to Acadia National Park, which was originally known as Eden. I collected 60,000 cubic feet of air. I brought it back to Utica, and I filled these 10-foot weather balloons that deflate throughout the course of the exhibition and change the atmosphere of the museum. Eventually, the entire installation disappears, and there's nothing left in the end. Other thing I'd been working with is these silver iodide prints. Essentially, the first form of photography used silver iodide, and it's also the chemical compound that they use to cloud seed with out west. And then I developed this other project called The Hole in the Sky. So you're my perfect audience for this because you are going to understand this. You know, in January and February, when it's just that gray that covers the whole sky and you're just like praying for a little bit of sunlight, I was like, man, I wonder if I can put a hole in a cloud. And I started to see these what they call punch hole clouds online. And it's interesting, this is the tie into War of the Worlds. Like all good things on the internet, people thought these were caused by UFOs. But I was sort of banking that they probably weren't. And so I sort of came up with this hypothesis based on where they were occurring. They were near airports. So I also researched they occur when there's altocumulus clouds, like the ones that you see here. And so I started to kind of predict when those cloud patterns would start to appear. And this is called a skew-T diagram. Every day twice a day, there are 11,000 balloons, weather balloons, that are launched at different locations around the globe, one of them being Buffalo. The balloons go up and measure temperature, wind, humidity, and a few other things. And that is what all weather forecasts are based on from that point on. So I kind of became a junior meteorologist, and when I found those perfect cloud conditions, I found a pilot in Rome, New York. So I would drive over there, we'd jump in a plane, we'd fly around Syracuse, and we'd put holes in clouds that's what I do. That project's still evolving. Like the thing that I'm working on right now is getting my math right, because I want to create like the light of heaven, right? Like the crepuscular rays. I think I'm gonna make a fortune in weddings. Like that's gonna be like, that's the retirement plan. So I had like moved on to the weather. You know, I still had the trees going. And what happened was the Tree of 40 Fruit project became viral. So it started to get picked up on the internet, and like, I don't even know what that says. And then after it went viral, it became a meme. So, and it was pretty embarrassing because I teach at Syracuse University, and my students would send me memes about the tree that they found online. And that ultimately led to to people calling me for interviews. So I got a call from Weekend Edition. I thought, man, I've made it, right? I'm gonna be on NPR's Weekend Edition. And so I do my like Weekend Edition interview. And Monday morning, I got a call from the USDA and the Department of Defense in the same morning within a 3-hour period. So the USDA calls and they're like, what the hell are you doing? And the Department of Defense calls and is like, what the hell are you doing? Do you want to come talk to us? And so I was a little suspect because it was DARPA. And, you know, they invent like rockets and driving cars and the internet, not like Al Gore. So I go down to talk to them, and they were panicked, right? Food security has become a major threat to the country. And this is where I'll tell you about the Cavendish banana, right? Has anybody heard about this okay. So the Cavendish banana is the one variety of banana that we know, right? That's the one at the grocery store. And what happened, I think it's about 5 or 6 years ago now, there's a fungus that started to affect the banana plantations. And it's killing off this variety of banana. Now to further complicate the issue is that anywhere it's good to grow a banana, we've gotten rid of all the heirloom varieties, all the sort of native species to plant these Cavendish bananas. And now that banana is on its way out. Another few years, we will not have that banana. And what's really scary is the varieties that we use to make that are now gone. So everyone is scrambling to do that, and it woke the Department of Defense up because they realized that with the monocultures we've created, we only grow a handful of varieties, and that if something happens to these handful of varieties, we won't have food. And so they were asking, what I was doing, and the interesting thing with it was they were like, we want to give you money. And I was like, wow, okay. Okay, I'll take your money. And they're like, the one catch is that you need to develop a technology for this. And I was like, there isn't a technology. what this requires is people just caring for things. That's it. You graft the trees, you take care of them. That's what's required. And so it came back to that idea of technology again, and I started to come to understand the extent to which we're not only fascinated with it, but it's really one of the only things that we fund. Like, I don't know of a college professor that could get tenure by preserving heirloom fruit varieties. Like, that just doesn't make sense, right? That's why everyone wants to create a new fruit variety that they can market and they can sell. So I shifted gears again, and I went back and I started to study all of the varieties. At this point, I had collected 250 to 300 heirloom varieties. And so these are varieties before 1945, before the industrialization of agriculture, going back, in some cases, over 2,000 years. And to give you an idea of the diversity of the fruit, these are plums that were collected from 1 week in August from one tree of 40 fruit, right? And so, you know, you have plums that are almost golf ball size. There's others that are nearly the size of an apple. What also became really terrifying that the USDA informed me of is that I had one of the largest collections outside of the USDA. And I thought that was terrible, right? Like, I'm an art. Yeah, there's like, I don't want to reveal too much personal information about why that's bad, but that's bad. And I'm like, how the hell could this happen, right? What had happened is all of the research universities at one point had these large collections of agriculture so that farmers could come, taste the varieties, and see if they wanted to take them to market. That had all shut down and started to follow the monocultures that went with them, leaving me with definitely the largest collection in the eastern United States, but perhaps one of the largest public collection. So going into that research on these varieties, I started to create a field guide. So as the trees are growing, I'll go through and sort of study the morphology. But then I started to pour through 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century agricultural reports to find out their origin and where they came from. And it became really interesting, the stories of how they got here. Like one of the peaches that I grow, it's called an Indian blood cling. And it was believed to be discovered by the first English to arrive in Jamestown, right, in Virginia. So they found this peach, they took it back to England. In England, they go, actually, this is a French variety of a peach. They found out that it then was brought over by Spanish missionaries to Florida when on some of the first trips to the continent, and then it was grown by Native Americans for 150 to 200 years. And just sort of that type of story, and because all of the fruit comes to us from the east, from the west, from the south. So documenting all that, putting that into botanical drawings, and then these descriptions, and then that's a sample of what a rootstock would look like if I was to propagate the tree. And so I'm in the process of doing that for 300 varieties right now, which that seems like a lot of work when you say it out loud. Eventually that's evolved into an exhibition that accompanies that work. And included in the exhibition are these trunks. So I'll take the trunk section out of orchards before they're torn out. And so these are sort of 20 to 30-year-old trees. And the part that I'm really interested in is the graft section. Because it becomes really knotty and burly, starts to fold over on itself. I've also started to do herbarium specimens. When I found out that I might have this largest collection, it raised my anxiety level really high, because then I felt responsible. And to be honest with you, I lost about a dozen varieties. You know, there were a dozen varieties that I had that the USDA didn't have that are gone. And at that point, I sort of doubled down on my efforts, and I'm like, okay, what's everything I can do to preserve them? And eventually that became herbarium specimens. as you can see here. So I'm putting them all into a collection. Things have decidedly gotten darker. So I've started to do voucher specimens. So there's a very specific protocol for these to eventually go into an herbarium or go to the Smithsonian. There's a very specific measurement of the board that they're mounted on. The other thing that I'm working on this year is DNA sequencing every single variety, so that if at some point the variety perishes, we'll still have this as sort of that DNA marker to it. So in doing all of these things, though, what I found is that I'm going back to these sort of old methods of working and of not only growing but preserving these varieties. And I realized that I had really not done many workshops for my, related to my art practice before, but I sort of wanted to share all of this. So I've been doing workshops with school groups like crazy. So for this particular exhibition, so that was this summer at the McCall Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. What I would do is take school groups, we would go through a walk through the city, they would collect branches, flowers, we would bring them back, they would do a botanical drawing, and then we would use this book press to press all of them, and they would come back two weeks later and have an herbarium specimen. The other thing that I started doing is taking the drawings that I was doing and turning them into etchings. And so we ran off like 200 etchings for a workshop, and we had all of these families come for an open studio where they did hand coloring. So hand coloring is essentially the same thing as watercolors, and that's how they used to do all of the old botanical illustrations. And it turned out pretty interesting because the kids would start, and then the parents would feel like they could do better. And so they sort of jumped in and they would start doing their own. And we actually had to do Xerox copies to kind of keep it going. I think there were, in the end, there were like 300 botanical watercolors that were done. And I'm like, that's probably a good percentage of refrigerators in Charlotte that they're pinned to at this point. And then the work recently has extended into looking into the folklore surrounding these different fruits. So I was reading my Peaches of New York, which is a book that was published in the early 1900s, and it listed all of the peaches that were grown in the United States at the time. The book contains like 3,000 different varieties. But it had this one anecdote about in China, how there's a ritual where you collect peach branches during a solar eclipse. You soak them in salt water till the next new moon, and then they become magic wands, right? Because the new growth on a peach tree is a wand. And I was like, well, this is just something I'm gonna have to do. So during the solar eclipse last year, I had a friend of mine who was in Oregon who has an orchard right under where the eclipse was passing. And I don't know why he agreed to this, but during the eclipse, he went out and collected all of these branches for me, shipped them to me, and I soaked them in salt water. Recently, CCTV, which is China's central television, came. They did an hour-long episode on the tree of 40 fruit, which I still find preposterous. It's for a series called The Empire of Fruit. I'm like, oh, like these, that's my country, right? Like those people love fruit. So I'm trying to explain what this project to them, and they I'm like, oh my God, were they completely wrong in this Peaches of New York book? Did this ever really happen? And they're like talking, the whole film crew's talking, and they come back to me and they go, oh yeah, you mean for warding off zombies? And I'm like, exactly. Other projects with taking peach seeds, turning them into strands, and then also sort of revealing the effects of the change in the climate through these trees. It was 2015, I had half of the trees in my nursery die. They started to blossom early, and the trees broke dormancy, and then it froze again. and you could just pretty much draw a line across the middle of the tree where it had died, right? It had, all the moisture inside of the tree had frozen. So I've been, I sort of hit a point with all of this too, because like as I said, my anxiety level of growing these trees, losing those particular varieties, and I started to realize that creating the tree of 40 fruit, doing all this documentation of it, preserving isn't enough. Like, these things actually need to be reintroduced. And so I started, I came across this term Strijobstvisa through some of the readings through the agricultural reports. So this is a term that developed in the 15th and 16th century in Germany. And what it is used for, it describes the orchards that medieval cities would create. So collectively, people in the city would go out, clear land, plant fruit trees, and they would plant in this sort of scattered planting, right? So it wasn't that grid pattern that we know as an orchard now. And they would use the open spaces within the orchard to graze cattle, but then they also realized that they could use it for other things. And that model of planting became the predecessor for the modern park, right? And so the things I really liked about it are this sort of collective aspect and using the orchard as a site, sort of as an aesthetic site, because it is really beautiful, and it's beautiful sort of throughout the summer. Spring, obviously, you have the blossoms, and a lot of cultures build recreation around the orchard itself. So going to fresh eating tours, going to tastings around the orchard. So I was like, okay, I've got to find a place that's going to plant all 300 of these different varieties and keep it going. And the sad part is I can't even tell you, but I'm going to show you some pictures, and if you notice something, it is what it is. So these are the original renderings for the Strijobstvisa. What I can say is that it is very close to New York City. And what this orchard will do is it's not only going to preserve those 300 varieties, but it's going to act as a gene bank, right? And it's going to be the only publicly accessible gene bank. Every other gene bank for fruits is through some government or institution, and you're pretty much limited in your access to it. And what I want this to be is I want people to be engaged with these trees throughout the year. And so here's another picture of it. And really all of that sort of, being that accessible public gene bank is really based on the idea of an experiment station. So back in the 19th century, the government realized that agriculture was our primary driver of the economy, and so they granted thousands and thousands of acres to the primary higher ed institution in the state. And it was their responsibility to grow and preserve different crops so that people could come try them and taste them. And so this is the beginning of the orchard, and kind of central to it now is that I have real problems with the idea of social practice within art. In many ways, I feel like when I've seen it, it becomes another form of plop art where you drop off a sculpture, but this is a kind of, with social practice, it takes even more responsibility from the community. And so what I'm trying to do is, to tie people throughout the entire work. And so I've been doing grafting workshops, showing people how to make their own tree of 40 fruit. I do plantings with the trees, again, the fresh eating tours. And for this particular project, I'm taking all the recipes that I found from those agricultural reports, and I'm doing a cookbook, which I'm kind of excited about that. I might be the male version of Gwyneth Paltrow in a couple years, so I just want you to think about that for a little bit. And hopefully throughout all of this is that the varieties will start to spread. What I'm currently working on is my own album of pomology. with all of the information about these varieties. And by doing grafting workshops in that orchard, showing people and open sourcing the entire project to show people how to create their own tree of 40 fruit, they'll be able to access the branches from the trees, collect them, take them, and hopefully keep growing and grafting them. So these are, and then the other thing, so these are all the copper plate engravings that I'm currently working on as part of that album. And then I'll close with like a weird project that I'm doing right now. So going back to the idea of grafting, I'm working with a Japanese biotech firm, which is another weird, like, the good thing about the Tree of 40 Fruit is the emails that I get. So out of the blue, this biotech firm emailed me and said, we think that we've developed a way to do cross-family grafting. So with the Tree of 40 Fruit, the reason why it's all stone fruits is that stone fruits have the unique ability to graft across family. That isn't the case with palm fruits, right? You can't take apples and pears and graft them together. So you can only graft within families. So they said, yeah, we think we've developed this, and it's actually using a close cousin of tobacco. So it's Nicotiana glauca, which is a tobacco tree. It's native throughout South America, and it's become an invasive species in the southwest US. But it turns out that you can use it to go from different plants to different plants. And so these are some of the first trials that we had done with the Nicotiana. And here's some more. And this is the project that I'm currently working on up at UB in their greenhouses, is doing trials with the glauca. This is Nicotiana benthamiana, which is a particular strain it's a model plant that's been used in a lot of scientific research up until now. What it's going to enable me to do is actually revisit this project and create an entire garden that grows off of one single plant. And the other thing that it's going to enable me to do is essentially to create cornucopias that grow on one tree or one root structure. So as I'm envisioning it now, it's sort of like, you look at the piece from the front and it's this like sort of gorgeous, a gorgeous cornucopia, or, recreating these still lives, Dutch still lives. And then like on the back of the piece, you actually see these are living things all connected to just one structure. The practical application of it, and what I'm working with that biotech firm, is I recently was commissioned to create 10 of the Tree of 40 Fruit for the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates. So, which was, that was a weird trip last spring. That was like unlike any other trip that I've had. And while I was there, they had shown me the forest that they have. So the original king of the UAE planted a forest of 3 million trees on the highway that extends between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And they water all of these trees, right? So every tree is watered. They're even doing citrus right now. I was pretty shocked to find that the UAE is really actually progressive, looking for clean energy and also looking to become food sustainable within 20 years. And so they were very interested in the grafting project, and it looks like we're going to be going there to also graft onto these desert trees. And the idea is to be able to grow food crops in the desert, because these trees have such deep tap roots that they won't require that extensive a watering system. And I was talking with John, he's like, whoa, we're getting a little far from art. And I was like, it's kind of true, but if you can like save kids' lives through growing crops in the desert, I'm like, I can take a little break from art for a little bit for that, I think. So that's it. Thank you.
questions. The first one, I didn't quite get, how do you make holes in clouds? And also let me just throw out my second question. Do you notice with the 3 of 40 fruit, how is there disease resistance and pest resistance? Does that, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of breezed over that one. Okay, I'll go back to the cloud. All right, so those altocumulus clouds that look like mackerel sky are composed of super cooled water droplets, right? So they're so cold, they should really fall as rain, but they don't have anything to nucleate on. And so what I figured out is that if you excite them, right, they actually start to slam together, and the weight of them causes them to fall, right? So by flying a plane through, not only the propeller, but also the negative pressure created off the foil of the wing can send enough of a shot through the cloud that it causes a small chain reaction around where the plane passes. So that's it. In terms of the disease resistance and those sorts of things, okay, a couple things that I do is I make sure that all my varieties are virus indexed, right? So I'll actually have them virus indexed through the USDA now, and I'll have varieties that are clean. The trees, don't buy trees from box stores. I can give you guys like good places to buy trees, but those are the places where most diseases are, right? There's a couple like peach dwarfing virus, NSRPV, like that are carried through those trees. The other things that I do I do all organic, and then I've started to adopt old agricultural practices that I found through those agriculture manuals. So some of the things that I'll do is I take the top 3 to 4 inches of mulch and soil away every year. I put it on a pile and have another pile that's sat for a year that I'll use to dress the trees, and that'll take away 75% of the pests in the area. Trees are gonna, I also kind of have a philosophy where if you start using pesticides on a tree, you're gonna have to use them throughout the tree's life. And usually if a tree is infected with pests, it's usually an indication of soil condition. Like 99% of the time, you can amend the soil, resolve the problem without dumping chemicals on it. So yeah, it's using a lot of those kinds of strategies, using companion planting.
But you don't find that, like, by sticking on this particular variety of, say, apricot that's particularly vulnerable to some sort of disease, then all of a sudden the whole tree has, do you know what I'm asking? Like, if like certain varieties are particularly vulnerable to a certain, like, whatever, fire blight or something, that the whole tree that you have to watch out for all these vulnerabilities from all 40 varieties.
Yeah, I haven't found that. I mean, and that still just kind of rattles me. Like, just to think of that idea, because the tree, like, they'll maintain their own growing habit and genetic identity for each graft, right? So that, it's really strange. Like, the diseases, I mean, knock on wood with all this. Anytime I'm like thinking about tree disease, I get, even more excited. Yeah, I find that it's less systemic. Yeah, it's weird. And I think the other thing too that helps is that these aren't in a 300 tree planting, right? Like when you get like a huge density of like orchards, right? Diseases just spread continuously. So I think that's another thing. These are isolated. Generally, they're miles from an orchard. Well, who knows, like hundreds of miles from a stone fruit orchard, right? So, yeah.
I was wondering what your perspective or your take on genetic chimerids or genetic modification of your stuff is compared to what you're doing post-German.
Yeah, because it's I don't know. There's part of me that is like, it's just a more refined way of doing what we've been doing for 10,000 years, right? But I think that the reason why most people have a strong reaction against it is they don't understand why, right? And the why of why most of our crops are genetically modified now is not a good why. Like, the reason for that is that we're trying to create crops that will keep longer when we ship them, that don't taste as good, right? And are essentially support monocultures. And so in just talking to people about their reactions to genetic modification, I really do think it comes down to that. You know, we don't want genetically modified fruit because that's the stuff that supports the growing system that's right now. The interesting thing that's come about, and it's something that I'm dealing with right now, is that the biotech firm that I'm working with they want to open up a new line of inquiry where they can use this Nicotianic glauca as a means to deliver RNA proteins and modify on the fly, right, with plants. And at first I was like, I don't want to be involved with this, but the one thing I realized that I could do is if this technology develops, is that this would give me the capability, if I had like the last specimen of one of the trees, I could actually graft this Nicotiana onto it, and you can modify the trees to save it. So I don't know. I continue to be conflicted about it, but generally always come out on the side of like, if you can figure it out in a way that isn't invasive, that's probably the best way to go with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about two things. One, if there's a particular rootstock that you like to use for the tree of 40 fruit, and then just how you handle like yearly pruning with that many varieties.
Oh god, yeah. It's like the two veins of my existence. It's awesome. Okay, so I actually didn't talk about that. This was a bad talk. I didn't tell you guys anything. So to create the tree of 40 fruit, I actually I'll use several different types of rootstock and inner stock. So the rootstock, sort of my go-to, is Myrobalan 29C, right? So that's a disease certified rootstock. They tend to be a little bit larger than semi-dwarf trees, so reaching 20 or so feet. But you can't graft everything to it. So cherries don't readily graft onto plum trees. And so what I'll need to do is use an interstock variety in order to graft cherries onto a plum tree. So for that, it took me 5 years to find a naturally occurring cherry plum hybrid from Spain. And I was able to source it, and so I used that as sort of an interstock to go from one variety to the next. So yeah. And then the pruning is just, so what I do, like, I'll prune the trees for the first 5 years after they're planted, and until like the grafts have really formed. And what I'll do is, if I'm like, generally that's sort of like the end of my visits. And so what I'll do is I'll paint white marks where the tree transitions to another branch, and just tell people don't prune any of the white marks off. That's pretty much it. Like, just don't prune the white marks off and you're all right. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this process of having these projects all over the world, and that you kind of get these started and then you have to have other people maintain them, and then I presume that you probably come and check on them on occasion, or like how is working like that?
It's exhausting. So I go and visit every single one of the trees at least once a year, right? So I'm like, I mean, let me tell you, from February through May, I'm like, it's crazy, right? And I don't know, like I still feel, and it's like well beyond sort of any contract that I've signed with people, but it's like I keep, and people, it's kind of weird because people are like, you're still coming back. The sort of positive aspect of it, I would say, is that wherever these trees have been placed so far, I've been able to like develop really good relationships with people. So yeah, so that's actually kind of been really nice. And yeah, I'm not good at the handing off part. So I do. I travel, with young trees in their first, 5 years, I'll go twice a year to those. And then the older trees, I'll just go once a year to them. I don't know. Other than that, though, it's pretty awesome. You get to travel. I get to go to California in January. That's nice. Yeah, with the projects, some of the other projects, it's nice to partner with people too, who are sort of taking on some of the responsibilities.
What tree next? Nuts?
Oh God, no. Well, okay. So I got into apples, right? Because I was a snob for like 5 years. I was like, I'm not gonna grow any damn apples, right? Because like New York, it's like you can't like turn around with running into an apple tree. So I figured that's pretty well covered, right? But then I'm like sitting there and I built a cold cellar in my house, and I'm like, I could keep apples in here. And so next thing you know, I've got like 200 different apple varieties going. Pawpaws, I think, that's something I'm interested in. Although, here's another part I forgot of this lecture. My great-grandfather made his living grafting fruit trees, right? So he grafted a lot of peach orchards in southeastern Pennsylvania. But his real love was persimmon trees. So I think persimmons might be the next tree I'll start growing some more of. Yeah.
When you took over the orchard from the research institution, I'm not sure what we're talking about, were you able to save any of the rootstock of those heritage? Because it seems that the rootstock from the heritage varieties would be more stable than the rootstock of something that's been developed to be a rootstock.
Yeah, I mean, there was really no way to collect those, because the only way to actually get the rootstock to start to sprout was to cut down the tree, right? Because if you cut down the top of the tree, a lot of, it'll force up the rootstock. I did research it though, and I'm using, so Mirabilin plum stock is actually a European plum variety, right? So it grows these tiny, small little yellow plums. And so that's been around for eons, right? And so I know that was used at least 100 years ago, if not longer. There's another variety called St. Julian that I'll use from time to time as well, and that also, it's a plum rootstock. So.
Have you ever done any quizzes?
No, I haven't. I don't know. I think Syracuse might be. Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but I think Syracuse we get more snow than you guys get in Buffalo. I don't know. It's like a point of pride because I shovel it. So. But yeah, I don't know if Quinces would do well.
What do you do in your spare time?
I don't watch the Sabres, that's for sure. I had to pick a fight, I didn't get you on the snow. I had to,
You're probably a Jets fan too.
Oh no! Oh hell! There's only so low. Okay. Yeah.
So someone this summer told me that because of climate change, a lot of peach producers, like down in Georgia, say, are buying up land up here, like on Niagara Escarpment or Lake Ontario, and like reintroducing large-scale peach production because of they're banking on future climate change where it's going to be like too hot in Georgia.
Yeah.
For peaches. Does that sound right?
Oh yeah. I went, oh my God, I did this conference at NYU a couple years ago, and there was a NASA climatologist that showed the models for how the United States is going to change in the next 100 years. And it was like, it was devastating. There's essentially within 50 years, the southern tier of the country goes subtropic. And yeah, so you see people moving up here, buying land. I mean, one of the most interesting things that I heard was about 4 or 5 years ago, Eimskip, which is an Icelandic shipping company, moved their corporate headquarters from Norfolk, Virginia to Portland, Maine, because it was the first real, so this multi-billion dollar company that moved because they're going to be able to sail over the North Pole, right? And so there's already major shifts that are happening with, just in the economy due to that. And it's, that doesn't surprise me at all, because you can, I mean, the peaches that are grown in those few growers that are still on the lake it's amazing. It's a beautiful place to grow. Oh, and then within 100 years, or no, it's 75 years, like really the only arable land in this country is gonna be around the Great Lakes and Washington and Oregon. So it wouldn't surprise me to already see people buying land. Yeah, it's already on the, Boy, we can't end on that note. Oh, boy. I need to pick me up. Hey, yeah, there's a bar that's open. All right, well, thank you.